Why hello my fellow apes, I hope that you're well and that you've got a big cup of tea at the ready. Within this video I'm going to thoroughly break down three things, that being 1, the mistakes that I made within my video titled The Athletic Advantages of Transgender Athletes. 2, the mistakes that my most prominent critic, Ethel from Essence of Thought, made within her reply. And 3, the malice motive that she and others have been and still are ascribing to me. Given this, there's many knots to untie, and so let's just get straight to it. This is the mistakes of many on transgender athletes. So let's begin by delving into my mistakes. As said within my previous video, I personally believe that my most impactful blunders were not actually my intellectual mistakes, which I'll cover shortly, but rather my tone, narrative, and sheer lack of sensitivity. Of which, the most prominent example that people have pointed out, and one that I entirely acknowledge, is the clip that I showed of Joe Rogan commenting on Laurel Hubbard.
And everybody's like, this is crazy. She's an inspiration.
Yeah.
No, she's a guy! She used to be a guy, and now she's breaking these women's records. Like, what are we doing? This is crazy.
Yeah.
Within that moment, Joe was extremely insensitive, and by endorsing it, I was too, and I am genuinely sorry for that. In fact, let me make something as clear as I possibly can. While I very much believed, and still believe, that there's a discussion to be had about the fairness of allowing women who have experienced male puberty to compete against women who haven't, Laurel is a woman. Period. Another major mistake that I made in relation to tone is my whole narrative. Many have pointed out that by me saying such things as, and so here we have a very real example of a young, talented woman losing a potential scholarship and career due to this issue. I painted a picture of trans women essentially stealing competitions from non-trans women, and you're absolutely right. I really dropped the ball here, and I will do my utmost best not to make this mistake again. In fact, going forward, I'll be very conscious of my narrative and language altogether, as such a sensitive topic requires nothing less. Truly, I should have known better. Now, I'm going to move on to my intellectual mistakes, but before doing so, I feel it's necessary to first address the repugnant motive that people such as Ethel are incessantly ascribing to me, as while I accept and truly appreciate many of Ethel's criticisms, I don't want to give the impression that I also accept the assertions of malice that she laces each and every with.
Oh dearie me, the ultralight man is here to teach us about his fears for women's sports. So what says he? What beckons the end of athletic womanhood? Of course, Stephen Woodford from Rationality Rules is jumping on the anti-trans bandwagon. Because when the Bible thumpers are too busy to blame us for every natural disaster on this planet, the trademark skeptics step up to claim that we're destroying Western civilization, piece by piece.
My motive and position was never, as Ethel and others have asserted, to attack trans women and their, quote, place in public.
Just as it means to attack trans women and their place in public.
And I certainly wasn't trying to, quote, cash in on a far-right paycheck.
Taking up the pussy hat at the whiff of a far-right paycheck amused me. Because Woodford's personal beliefs aside, that is who he caters to these days with his Soft on Shapiro videos.
What's more, I never said that trans women should be excluded from sports.
If trans women are excluded from said sports, as he argues they should be,
I never called for the removal of trans rights.
And the way he used this to argue for the removal of their human rights, he was calling for the removal of trans people's human rights.
I didn't blur any critical information in my ACA video, and my views were never, ever based on any prejudice whatsoever against trans people.
It's the fact that Woodford made his video from a standpoint of prejudice against trans people. He, as a creator, was acting on transphobic principles. When he made it, he formed his argument from sheer prejudice for trans women, based on preconceived notions and stereotypes of what they're like.
My motive, my concern, was and still is what constitutes fairness in sport. Trans women must be able to compete, and indeed as the gender they identify as, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's fair for trans women to compete in the same category as non-trans women. It might be, for example, perfectly fair for those who transitioned before male puberty, but unfair for those who transitioned after. But we'll get to such details a little later. Now, In addition to defaming me, Ethel has been pretty much defaming anyone who won't publicly denounce me, including Matt Dillahunty, Aaron Ra, Thomas Westbrook, Telltale, Rachel Oates, and even Mr. Atheist, for crying out loud. But yeah, for now at least, I'm done with this Essence of Drama segment, and I'll just reinforce that while I don't accept the following lacings of malice, I wholeheartedly accept and appreciate the intellectual criticisms.
Woodford utilised a basic bait and switch. He invited us to discuss the counter that trans women on HRT don't have an advantage due to said HRT. That was what he advertised. He then went on to assert that many of said traits remain in spite of HRT. That's when the switch took place. Instead of referencing articles on the differences between cis women and trans women who have undergone HRT, Woodford goes on to roll out articles discussing the differences between cis women and cis men.
Now this was, in my opinion, my biggest intellectual blunder. At the time, after explaining some of the reasons as to why men have an athletic advantage over women, I intended to show that while HRT evidently sufficiently reduces many of these advantages, such as hematocrit, it hasn't been shown to sufficiently reduce many other advantages, such as height, width, limb proportions, muscle fibre type, heart size, lung capacity, and muscle fibre. The problem, of course, is that I somehow failed to include the second part, and consequently, yeah, I damn messed up. I equivocated trans women with non-trans men, and that's a huge mistake that could have been fixed with just a paragraph or two. Another of my intellectual mistakes refers to hemoglobin.
Did you get that, you unrehearsed emotional college students? Hemoglobin is the #1 advantage cis men have over cis women. Well, this is awkward. You see, this is what happens when you attempt a bait and switch, using studies comparing cis women to cis men, rather than cis women to trans women on HRT. You end up talking a load of pure bollocks about hemoglobin being the greatest source of trans woman advantage, only to then discover that hemoglobin counts of trans women are the same as those of cis women.
Indeed, my views on hemoglobin were mistaken. You see, I had read a few studies which compared the mean hemoglobin levels of trans women to non-trans women, which indeed are significantly higher. But what those studies didn't make clear, and what I now know, is that while the average trans woman on HRT has greater hemoglobin in their blood than the average non-trans woman, it's still within the typical range of the latter. In hindsight, I should have focused on the aforementioned athletic advantages of muscle mass, height, and muscle fibre type, as HRT doesn't bring these advantages down to the typical range.
There's also another trick at play here. By focusing on the typical range of testosterone whilst discussing national and international level sports, you are implicitly claiming that women at such sporting events as the Olympics are representative of the typical woman.
This is also a fair criticism. I should have emphasised that while female athletes have, with very few exceptions, testosterone levels within the typical range of non-athletes, they do tend to sit on the higher part of that range. Though, and this might surprise you, as it did me, the opposite is true of endurance athletes. Research shows that circulating levels of testosterone, or current levels of testosterone, vary significantly from one athletic event to another. In explosive events, such as sprinting, swimming, cycling, kayaking, and speed skating, test levels are on the high end of the female range. But in endurance events, such as long and middle distance running, test levels are on the low end. And that's one of the reasons why the scientific community frequently notes that circulating testosterone isn't the be-all and end-all. It seems that just as fast-twitch muscle fibers are critical in some sports but negligible in others, the same is true of circulating testosterone. It's evidently less what one's current levels are and more what one's previous elevated levels have given them. So there's the mistakes that I made, or at least the majority of them. I'm now going to move on to Ethel's mistakes, but don't let that dampen mine. I screwed up, and I own that fact. While I reject the malice motive that some have attributed to me, I absolutely recognise that my honest mistakes caused real harm, and I am sincerely sorry for that. The original video is now delisted, and I've donated all of the ad revenue that it made to the transgender charity Sparkle. I know that it will never make up for the harm that I've caused, and that many of you will never consider me an ally again. I understand. So the first of Ethel's objections that I'd like to respond to refers to the fact that trans women don't always win.
What's interesting about the Rachel McKinnon case is the fact that the person responsible for attacking her, Wagner Asali, who came third, beat McKinnon in 10 out of 12 previous events. And not only did Asali fail to raise issue during those times, but apparently those 10 times can be ignored since McKinnon won the 2018 UCI Track Championship. The implication here being that a trans woman competing isn't a problem, just so long as she never wins.
Ethel went on to make the same point about Laurel Hubbard.
Whilst Hubbard holds the snatch record, she does not hold the clean and jerk record or the total record for her category.
And also in regards to Hannah Mouncey.
Also, she's been on the losing team before, so it's not like her presence guarantees victory.
Now, the problem with this objection is that it completely misses the point. If one has an unfair advantage but loses, they still had an unfair advantage. Fairness, which is the foundation of sports and athletics, isn't about who crosses the line first. It's about ensuring that all participants spring from the same starting block. If I ran a marathon against Mo Farah and was given a 30-minute advantage, he'd still easily beat me, but I'd still have had a significant unfair advantage. Hence, the question is whether or not McKinnon, Hubbard, Mouncey, and other trans women who have experienced male puberty still retain any of the athletic advantages that they receive from said male puberty. And if they do, whether or not they constitute a too greater advantage in the specific events that they desire to compete in. At elite level athletics, in most events the difference between first and second place is less than 1%. I'll say that again as it's absolutely critical. In most events, the difference between first and second place is statistically less than 1%, and so any retained advantages that are not mitigated by other disadvantages is simply too much. To quote Noel Plum, who recently released an absolutely brilliant video on this subject,
"In sport, when it comes to performance enhancement, close enough is not close enough."
and this brings us comfortably to the burden of proof and where exactly it lies.
Woodford needs to do 3 things. First, he needs to show which of these traits survive the HRT process and to which degree. Second, he needs to demonstrate superior performance on part of trans women on HRT. Third, he needs to demonstrate a causal relation leading from point 1 to point 2. Without that, he has nothing.
Actually, no. The burden of proof is on you, us, and here's why. Given that in most events men outperform women by 10 to 30%, we need to show that HRT completely removes, or at least sufficiently mitigates, the athletic advantages granted by male puberty, and until we do that, we are not justified in claiming that fairness has been achieved. Now, thanks to Joanna Harper, and this is another thing that I'll elaborate on within my upcoming video, I'm currently convinced that when it comes to long and middle distance running, the burden either has been met or it's close to being met, since in these events they rely very heavily on hemoglobin, and HRT does indeed lower hemoglobin to the appropriate level. But in other events, and especially those which pivot on such things as height, frame, and fast twitch muscle fibers, the burden not only hasn't been met, it's heavier than it's ever been before, which is to say that the evidence is overwhelmingly to the contrary. Again, I'll elucidate on this and the burden of proof in detail in the future, but I feel compelled to give the short of it now since it's certainly relevant. So, let's get to Ethel's next objection.
Miller beat Seoul by 0.37 seconds, yet Miller's own time was still 0.35 seconds slower than the current women's record, which stands at 6.65 seconds. Does that then mean that cis women have clear advantage over trans women?
This criticism, of course, relates to trans women not always winning, and it suffers from all the same flaws. If one has an unfair advantage but loses, they still had an unfair advantage. Yes, due to HRT, Miller's testosterone is likely now within the range of non-trans women, and because of this, some of the benefits that she received from male puberty are now mitigated, such as circulating hemoglobin. But other benefits haven't been, such as muscle mass. Now don't get me wrong, HRT reduces muscle mass by over half, but to again quote Noel,
"Cutting half is not good enough. Cutting whole is what it has to be. You need to go all the way or have some mitigating factors that will counteract it for it to count. But cutting half, it's not close enough. Close enough is never close enough when it comes to a performance advantage, an unfair performance advantage in sport."
Okay, So now I'd like to respond to the most frequent criticism that I've received, that being that trans women have been able to compete since 2004, and yet they haven't come to dominate. Ethel and many others see this as strong evidence for trans women not having an advantage whatsoever.
And to that end, I'd just like to note the fact that the Olympics has allowed trans women to compete since 2004. That's 15 years of trans women being allowed to compete at the Olympic level. And in spite of all of this, trans women have not come to dominate said games. Again, we have 15 years of trans women being allowed to compete in female categories at the Olympics. Yet we have absolutely no evidence of what you claim will happen unless we act quickly.
Yes, trans athletes have been able to compete since 2004, but up until 2015, and effectively 2016, the rules were drastically different. Until 2015, trans women had to 1. Be legally recognised as a woman, which of course was near impossible for those living in countries in which changing one's gender is illegal. 2. They had to have undergone gender reassignment surgery, which is to say they had to have removed their testicles. And 3. They had to have received appropriate hormone therapy for at least 2 years. Now, this might not sound like a huge change from today's rules of 1. Non-legally identifying as a woman, and 2. Having testosterone levels below 10 nanomoles per litre for 12 months, but it is. While our adrenal glands produce a very small amount of testosterone, the vast majority comes from our gonads, that being the ovaries in women and testes in men. Hence, without testicles, a trans woman can't produce anywhere near the 10 nanomole limit, and will almost entirely depend on exogenous testosterone to maintain sufficient levels. However, with testicles, a trans woman can simply reduce her HRT as to allow her testosterone to be much closer to the 10 nanomole limit. Now you might be thinking, wait, Steve, why are you so certain that such manipulation is likely to occur? Well, that's my next topic.
Woodford seems to be taking it as a given that since these are the limits for sport, that most trans women in sport will aim to sit on the very edge of said limit. But how does that relate to reality? According to the guidelines put out by the International Planned Parenthood Federation, anti-androgens, also known as testosterone blockers, should be used to reduce the rates of testosterone in trans women's bodies to somewhere between 30 to 100 nanograms per deciliter, just above 3 nanomoles per litre, the typical range for a cis woman.
From here, Ethel goes on to cite recommendations from several other medical institutions to bolster her point.
None of which come anywhere near the 288 nanograms per deciliter, the 10 nanomoles per litre that Woodford is crying about.
And she concludes by reasoning that because of this, trans women are at a disadvantage in regards to testosterone.
In fact, many of these suggested targets cap trans women's testosterone levels at the lower end of a typical range for cis women. So if anyone is at a sporting disadvantage in regard to testosterone, it's most of trans women on HRT.
Now, to be honest, this objection is naive. The truth is that athletes have, and still do, sacrifice their health and safety in pursuit of their goals, as they know all too well that if they don't, they'll be outcompeted by those who do. Back when steroids were legal, and like today, not medically recommended, athletes happily admitted to taking them.
Steroids are taken 8 or 9, 10 weeks before competition. It's not a healthy thing to do, but it's being used.
Did you take them?
I took them, yeah, up until the competition, 8 or 9 weeks before competition, and it was something that everybody had to do in order to get an equal chance to, to compete.
And even when steroids were banned, athletes did, and still do, everything they can to pass drug screening, despite the fact that they know that getting caught will likely end their career. Another more recent example that comes to mind is MMA and the issue of testosterone replacement therapy. Long story short, institutions such as the UFC once allowed participants who had a prescription for TRT to compete. As a result, it has been suggested that participants took steroids to suppress their natural testosterone, and then, after their cycle, went to their doctor in the attempt and very often success of being prescribed TRT. They didn't care about their health, they cared about winning. Why? Because they're athletes, and that's what athletes do. They do what it takes to win. The point is, athletes will, more often than not, operate at the very limits of what's permitted. And since the IOC, as of 2015, no longer requires trans women to undergo gender reassignment surgery to compete, and hence keep their testicles, hovering at around 8 to 9 nanomoles per litre is an extremely viable advantage for trans women to utilise. In fact, this is one of the primary reasons that Joanna Harper, among many others, are campaigning to reduce the level to 5 nanomoles per litre.
I am part of a committee that has recently recommended that we lower that limit from 10 to 5.
Now, what's a little odd to me is that in other areas, Ethel seemingly accepts this competitive inevitability.
The Olympics and similar national and international level sports are not a children's gym class. They are the pinnacle of human capability. Nations are willing to pour millions of dollars into Olympic teams for the chance to win gold medals, and they'll do their research to figure out the easiest way to maximize that.
Indeed they will, and they know that hovering at 8 to 9 nanomoles provides trans women with a massive advantage in many events. The next objection I'd like to address relates to men typically having larger bodies than women.
But the presupposition that larger bodies benefits trans athletes is just that, a presupposition in need of evidence to back it up.
Yes, having a large body isn't an advantage in many events, such as equestrian and gymnastics, but in events such as weightlifting and hammer throw, to give just two examples, it very much is. In fact, the fact that men are on average taller and wider than women widely is recognised as one of the primary factors for the massive gap between them. And again, HRT doesn't sufficiently mitigate height and width. If Mountsy, for example, hadn't have experienced male puberty, she wouldn't be as tall and as wide as she is. Anyhow, the last objection I'm going to tackle is the most prominent study that Ethel referenced.
There is no direct and consistent research to suggest that transgender female individuals and transgender male individuals have an athletic advantage in sport, and therefore the majority of competitive sports policies are discriminatory against this population.
Indeed, this is the very study that many claim, including Dusty Smith, proves that trans women have no advantage.
Sports, medicine, trans. That's how easy this is to find. And, okay, boom, the very first link that comes up. The most basic amount of research you could possibly fucking do, right? So why did he not share the most in-depth scientific study with his audience on the subject he is talking about? Instead, why did he show a Joe Rogan clip instead of sharing the science? Well, in my opinion, it's because the most in-depth study that is done on the subject goes against his narrative, and he doesn't want you to know that.
Now, I'm going to thoroughly break down all of the relevant papers, including this one, in my future video. But to briefly address it now, let's go a step further than Dusty and do
The most basic amount of
reading. First off, if you read the title, you can see that it's a systemic review of the literature relating to sport participation and competitive sport policies, which is to say, it's not a review of athletic performance, a fact that the authors make even more clear in their objective. Scrolling down, if you read the method, you'll see that of the 8 studies that it references, 6 are interviews, with most having a sample size less than 5, and only 1 study actually relates to trans athletic performance, that being Goran and Bunk. And if you read their study, you'll see that among other things, that while HRT significantly reduces muscle mass in trans women, it doesn't reduce it to anywhere near the same level as non-trans women. Anyhow, back to the systemic study, as from here things just get worse. The authors not only assert that
there is no direct and consistent research to suggest that transgender female individuals and transgender male individuals have an athletic advantage in sport,
but also that there's no direct or consistent research to suggest that they have any advantage at any stage of their transition, e.g. cross-sex hormones and gender-confirming surgery. I'll say that again. Any stage. Which is to say that if your position is that trans women should be able to compete so long as they're on HRT, then you ain't getting it from this review. But yeah, more on that to come. Okay, it's been a long one and you're probably out of that tea, and so let's wrap up. There's been an absolute ton to cover, and while I've probably missed a thing here and there, I hope that at the very least you, like me, have learned something. This topic is much more complicated than most, including my former self, are making it out to be, so please be wary of those who are still claiming that it's straightforward, because it isn't. Anyhow, I'll publish my views within a week or two, but until then, I highly, highly recommend that you check out the video from Noel Plum that I referenced earlier. Today, it is in my opinion the best video on the subject out there. Noel's evidently been interested in this topic for years, and it shows. Go check it out. As always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via PayPal and merchandise. It's been a bumpy road as of late, and I want to thank you all for sticking with me. Thank you.